So that has been very nice.
And are we in your office right now?
No, I'm right now actually in my home office. They're still restricting the opening hours. And actually today I wasn't allowed to come because we have like, a certain number of people who can come by per day. But I've been lucky. I can come a few days a week. So
one of the exciting parts is that folks from all over the world can join us during this time. What time is it by you?
We have it now 8:30 in the evening. It's getting dark. Just got dark,
right.
Actually. I got my lights on.
I think we have hit our inflection point of participants. So let's begin. I'm Keith Marzilli Erickson. I'm moderating today's session of the Electronic Health Economics Colloquium, the 11th such session. And we're delighted to have Tobias Klein here to talk. Tobias is a professor at Tilburg University. His research is on health economics, empirical I/O, including advertising and reminders, as we heard in our brief chit chat, and econometrics. Among many other things, he is the deputy managing editor of the Econometrics Journal. Today's paper is The Response to Dynamic Incentives in Insurance Contracts with a Deductible, Evidence from Differences in Regression Discontinuities Design. It's joined with Martin Salm and Suraj Upadhyay. Today, question and answer function in Zoom for questions. So if you are an attendee, you can post questions in that question and answer. Some of those will be answered by Martin and Suraj by typing, and some of them will answer live, and I'll bring some of those to I'll interrupt at various points. We're expecting about 60 minutes of presentation and about 10 minutes for questions at the end. Go ahead, Tobias.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to the organizers for making this happen. Very much pleased to give this talk here on Zoom in this very nice seminar series. So as you said, this is joint work with Martin Salm and Suraj Upadhyay. So what do? We come back to that, to some extent old question: how do patients respond to dynamic incentives implied by deductibles in health insurance contracts? Let's first of all bring everybody on the same page. Deductibles, what does that mean? That means, for the first X euros, dollars of healthcare consumption in a year, you pay out of pocket, and then insurance coverage kicks in. What that does is it gives rise to dynamic incentives, and that in turn leads us to the question how patients actually perceive these dynamic incentives. Do they think of this in a static way? Do they say, right now I have not reached the deductible limit, I have to pay for care consumption, and therefore I'm going to consume less? Or are they a little bit more forward-looking, and do they say something like, gee, I have a chronic condition, of course I have to pay right now, but actually I'm going to exhaust the deductible this year anyway, and therefore care is for free anyway, and I'm going to consume some more care for that reason, which of course brings us to moral hazard as the price effect that always operates in the background here. Now, what is the motivation for us to study that question and to come back to that somewhat classic question? First of all, annual deductibles are a common feature of health insurance contracts. When you look at the data, more than 80% of the employer-sponsored health insurance policies actually feature a deductible, and in countries like the Netherlands, it's actually mandatory that they do feature a deductible. Now, when you then think about how the deductible limit affects healthcare spending on a yearly level, then yes, you get to the conclusion fairly quickly that this will operate through the response to dynamic incentives. Since the deductible limit is a key policy choice, either for policymakers who set the scene or for insurance companies, that brings us to the question, what is going on basically? So how can we how can we quantify the response to dynamic incentives? Now, a related question that we also find interesting is whether the response to these dynamic incentives actually is the same for different groups in the population, or whether some groups, say, understand better how they should act and therefore respond differently to dynamic incentives. So one might argue that one should be concerned if people who have the same healthcare needs consume very different amounts of care because they react differently to dynamic incentives. Obviously, there's huge literature here on this topic, and any literature slide or slides here will be necessarily incomplete. I've just put up a few papers to talk a little bit about the background. So first of all, there are obviously some very well-known handbook articles, these two here, and this paper here by Einaf and Finkelstein. And next to that, we have, say, three literatures that I quickly want to talk about. So first of all, theory. So when you think about it a little bit, then you realize rather quickly that we need some guidance for empirical analysis, right? So simply the question, what should I regress on what when I have data on healthcare consumption, let's say at the claims level, in order to study such a question. It becomes actually very clear that theory is really helpful because it provides guidance for empirical analysis. And I'm going to come back to that actually when I talk about the equation that we estimate in the end of the day. And then, you know, there are basically two approaches that people have been taking in the past. I've split up here into reduced form approaches and structural approaches. And, you know, that is very much what is happening. And sometimes these are seen as rivals. Sometimes these are seen as complementary. You know, we don't take a stance in this paper, actually. So what we say is, you know, there's something that we can do that is actually somewhere in between reduced form analysis and structural analysis. And I'm going to come to that actually as well very soon. So first of all, reduced form approaches. Here the question was, you know, when I take a measure of dynamic incentives, does that predict something? Do people react to that? So you can test basically whether people react to dynamic incentives. And the advantage of taking a reduced form approach is that it's fairly clear where identification comes from. So you can leverage, say, a variation that comes from a natural experiment, and it's very transparent what is going on, basically. For structural approaches, what people do is they spell out a full structural model and then they take it to the data. And although there are recently some attempts to make it more transparent where identification actually comes from, oftentimes it's a little bit less direct and less clear what identifies the parameters of those models. Plus, these models have a harder time allowing for heterogeneity. Now, when you look at these papers, both the reduced form and the structural papers, then what you see is that people have investigated this in particular contexts. So employer-sponsored health insurance policies, in particular Medicare Part D, which is perfectly you know, reasonable to do and perfectly interesting. But you know, it's not the case yet that there is one coherent picture, and also findings do differ a little bit between these papers. So some papers do find that dynamic incentives do actually matter, whereas other papers find that they don't matter at all. So let me just say, you know, this paper by Dalton and others, they estimate a discount factor. And, you know, when the discount factor is estimated to be 0, it basically means dynamic incentives don't matter. And this is what they find, right? At the same time, this paper here by Aaron Dine and others, they reject the null hypothesis that dynamic incentives don't matter. So they do find evidence for dynamic incentives to be at play. What do we contribute to this debate? What we find on the substantial side is actually that individuals do strongly react to dynamic incentives. So that was fairly visible from our results, and I'm going to walk you through all those. At the same time, or on top of that, we find that almost every group, subgroup in the population actually exhibits forward-looking behavior. That is, what we do find is not driven by people who are particularly good at solving hard decision problems. So we find it for high-income individuals, and we find it for low-income individuals, for instance. Then what we find is that changing dynamic incentives through increasing deductible limits has quantitatively important effects. So we do a little counterfactual simulation, and we end up with a number, what basically the effect would be of increasing the deductible limit from a very low amount, 375 euros per year, to 475 euros per year. And the effect is rather big, as I'll show later. Now, the title of this paper has a little methodological component to it. We allude to this idea of a differences in regression discontinuities design, and a big part of my talk will be to try and convince you that this is a very useful way of looking at dynamic incentives and actually identifying interesting parameters. And on top of that, what we do is we spend a lot of time deriving the reduced form equation that we actually estimate from a full structure model. And what that buys us is that we know exactly what these parameters are that we're estimating, and it helps us to actually then do a counterfactual experiment, something that normally reduced form papers try to stay away from. Good. Are there any questions at this point?
I don't see any in the Q&A or
Well,
the
that's
chat,
good.
so I think we can keep going.
Great. So let me explain how we do all that. The central piece to all this is this reduced form equation that I've put here on the slide. That is the equation for care consumption. So that will be care consumption at the individual level for individual I at time t. Time t you can think of as a day of the year. What is that equal to? It is equal to kappa IT minus two price effects. So let's first think about prices as being zero, so care is free. Then care consumption is equal to kappa IT. So you can think of kappa IT as some baseline consumption plus some error term. Okay, so you can decompose this into, say, kappa I plus epsilon IT. Now we have these two price effects. There is a PITC. So for individual I at time t, there's a so-called current price. That current price will be 1 if care is not for free. So when individual I will have to pay out of pocket, and it will be 0 when the deductible has been hit. The second price is PE. That is the expected end-of-year price, so sometimes also called future price for individual I from the perspective of time period t, right? And so think of, individual I on July 15 has consumed a certain amount of care, and then that is the question. The price is basically answering the question: what is the expected price I will have to pay for the last unit of care at the end of the year? Okay. So for instance, if I have consumed a lot of care, then it will be very likely that I will hit the deductible limit until the end of the year, and then that price will be very close to zero. Or think of an individual who is very healthy, has not consumed a lot of care yet, will likely not exceed the deductible limit, then that expected end of year price will be close to 1. Okay, and we can think of the second price effect as the effect of dynamic incentives, and the first price effect as the effect of static incentives. And these two gammas here tell us the relative importance of the two. When individuals are fully forward-looking and don't discount actually, then gamma C will be close to 0, and gamma E will be essentially the moral hazard effect. Now, when people are myopic, then gamma C will be very big and gamma E will be small. What is interesting for us now in this paper? Well, we focus on estimating gamma E, the response to dynamic incentives. And in the end of the day, we will actually compare what we find to the effect of static incentives. And that will tell us something about the relative importance of the two, or conversely about, how forward-looking are actually people, in the Netherlands. As I said, we have a full micro foundation in the paper. That is useful because this is not obvious at all that we should estimate such an equation like this one here. So the full micro foundation will not be part of the talk today. It's actually a very well-known material when you go back to the old papers, in some sense put together and extended a little bit. But that's all in the paper, that's all in the appendix, and it's all developed and briefly discussed in the body of the paper.
Tobias,
Yep.
Question from one of the panelists, David Slutsky. What about co-insurance, or more generally about prices? There's more than 2 segments. So, did you, in this context, just the deductible, or is there co-insurance and a maximum out of pocket?
Yeah,
just
so
nonlinear prices in general.
That's actually nice about the context here. We don't have to worry about these things. You can think of this as a very simple deal for people. There's just a deductible, and the deductible we will see is actually relatively low. What that means is dynamic incentives do actually matter. So it's not like a $2,000 deductible, it's a €375 deductible. Good. So this, let me make 2 points before I come to what we mean by differences in regression discontinuities design. This is a linear equation, and that is actually very helpful because we can aggregate, right? So it's actually very hard to calculate the PE at the individual level. It turns out we don't have to do that, and we can actually do our analysis at the aggregate level, and we can basically take the average PE, and it's relatively easy to calculate the average PE. All we have to do is we have to take the fraction of individuals who, by the end of that year, actually still have to pay for care. We don't have to do any fancy machine learning to learn about that average PE. The second point I want to make is that in general, when we look at this equation here, these prices will be endogenous. Okay, so that makes it actually hard to study the response to these 2 prices. This is nothing new. What is new is the way we approach this and the way we try to overcome this. Why are these prices endogenous? Think of it like this. Suppose somebody suffers from a health shock early in the year. That will mean that it's more likely that the current price is actually 0, right? Why is that? Because when I have a health shock, I will consume care, and when I consume enough care, then I hit the deductible limit, and that means that actually the price is going to be 0. If my current price is 0, then also the expected end of year price is 0. So any care consumption early in the year will also push down that expected end of year price. Okay, so that is not yet a problem, but it becomes a problem because these health shocks would be correlated over time, right? So when somebody suffers a health shock yesterday, he's more likely to suffer health shock also today, some follow-up stuff that is going on. We can come up with all kinds of stories, but then what you will have is that this health shock today is going to be part of the kappa, and the kappa will be correlated with these two prices. And that gives rise to the endogeneity problem that people have approached in various ways in various papers. All right, this is what we do in this paper. This is how we do it. We look at care consumption around the change of the year. And I'm going to illustrate this by looking at 2-year pairs. Okay, so here we have the change of the year from year Y to year Y plus 1. Here I have the change of the year from year Y plus 1 to year Y plus 2. I have care consumption at the end of the year. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at people who, for whatever reason, hit the deductible limit early in the year. Okay, until the end of August. So when they arrive, here at the last days in December, they have both prices equal to 0 here. So in year Y, both the current and the future or expected end of year price will be 0 for these individuals. Same for the second year pair. Now, 2 things are going to happen when they enter the new year. The current price will become 1 because deductibles reset at the beginning of the year, and also the expected end of the year price will be positive because the expected end of the year price is the expected price these individuals will pay for the last unit of care consumed in year now Y plus 1, because the second year of the year pair Y plus 1. Likewise, the current price is 1 in Y plus 2 for this year pair here, and also the expected end of year price for year Y plus 2 will be positive. And interestingly, what we do here is we compare 2 year pairs where the second year pair has a higher deductible. Okay, so when the deductible is higher, then it means that it will be less likely that I will hit the deductible limit, and that will mean that my expected end of year price is actually going to be higher. So this already gives away the variation that we can actually use, right? So I have a drop in care consumption here, and that drop is caused by 3 things, basically. There's seasonality. So for whatever reason, things are different in January than in December, seasonality. Second thing, I have a current price that changes from 0 to 1, and I have a future price that changes from 0 to something positive. Same thing here, I have the seasonality. I have the current price changing from 0 to 1, and I have the future price that now changes to a higher future price. And when you compare left to right, then you see that under the assumption that I will make very explicit in a couple of slides, that seasonality is the same for all year pairs, the difference in the jump size will be directly related to this future price. And that identifies the effect of dynamic incentives. That is the main idea of our identification strategy here. So if there are questions, here's a good place to ask questions about that.
Great. So this is a question again from David Slusky, panelist. Aren't people who hit their deductible early in the year fundamentally sicker than people who hit it at the end? Wouldn't it make more sense to look at people who unexpectedly hit their deductible early versus those who didn't?
That is a good question. So what we do is we do 2 things. So we do look at people who do hit early in the year. We do not ask the question, why do they hit? We do simply select those who hit early, but not too early. We actually exclude people who hit in January because we say, these are very different people. They hit early, very early in the year, and they should behave very differently. That's that. And at the same time, and this is the key thing we really have to do, is we have to make those 2 year pairs comparable to one another. Okay, so if I'm having a year pair where I have a very low deductible in the first year of the year pair, then those who will actually hit the deductible limit will on average be less sick than those who hit in a year pair where the first year has a very high deductible, right? So I need to take care of that problem for sure. So I need to make those 2 year pairs comparable to one another. So I don't need to select these events, but what I really have to do, that's our central point and insight, is to make those 2 year pairs comparable to one another. And we have a strategy for that based on some earlier work.
Great. So let's see. So question from the question and answer, how does this handle the selection problem? And I guess people selecting into high versus low deductibles? And I think you'll get to that.
I'm going to talk about the institutions in a minute. Yeah.
Great. So we'll defer the kind of like specific how you're doing it in this context questions up a little bit, and we're going to, yes, and we'll yeah, that'll make sense. Thanks.
Cool. All right. Let me first formalize that central assumption that we need to make that fly. So what we do is we start off with this linear equation for care consumption. So remember that was kappa minus those 2 price effects. Okay. So when I take that equation and I average across individuals, and I just look at average care consumption at a given moment on a given day of a given year, then here I have care consumption on average on the first day of year y plus 1 minus care consumption on the last day of year y. It's going to be given by this expression here. It's going to be the difference in the 2 kappas minus, again, 2 price effects. Why do I only get the prices on the first day of the year? Well, because I've selected my individuals in a way so that both prices were 0 at the end of year y. Okay, so therefore I only get these 2 prices here. The other 2 prices are already set to 0. Then what I do is I take the difference across year pairs. So I simply subtract this is for 1 year pair, and I subtract this for 1 year pair from the other year pair. So here y plus 2, y plus 1. This is the second year pair, and I subtract from that that difference for the first year pair. What do I get? I get the difference in the kappas for the second year pair minus the difference in the kappas for the first year pair minus, and now what I get is only that parameter gamma e times the difference in the 2 future prices between y plus 2 and y plus 1. So why is that? Well, because PC1 will be equal to 1 both in year y plus 1 and in year y plus 2. So actually these 2 current price effects or effects of static incentives will actually cancel out because they're there in the second year pair, they're there in the first year pair. I take the difference across year pairs, so these static effects will cancel out. So the only thing that will remain is gamma e times the difference in those 2 future prices. Now, what is our main identifying assumption? I already said it when I discussed the figure, and that is, in our view, similar to parallel trends. The assumption is that the seasonality going from December to January is the same in the second year pair as it is in the first year pair. And under this assumption, these 2 expressions here, so this one here will be equal to that one here. So that means here I have something I can learn about from data. It's going to be directly related to the change in dynamic incentives that I can measure. So the one thing that is left in this equation that is unknown and that I can therefore calculate is this parameter gamma e. And this is how gamma e is identified. That's the argument using formulas. Now, this brings me to the institutions and to the question that has been asked before. So the Netherlands, actually quite a nice setting to study this for various reasons. Let me tell you a little something about how people choose health insurance. So they essentially make two choices. One choice is which company do I go to, from which company do I buy insurance? And the second question is, how much of a voluntary deductible do I choose? Okay, so it's much simpler than in other countries because there is a so-called basic package that all insurance providers have to offer. That basic package, the contents of that basic package are mandated by law. So every year a commission or some body sits down and they determine what is in the basic package, and that's about it. There's a mandatory deductible, as I said earlier. That mandatory deductible was in 2009, 155 euros, and then it increased gradually over time. So in the last year of our data, 2015, it was equal to 375 euros. Now, that voluntary deductible, and there's actually a paper that Ben Hendel presented in the IO series some time ago. That voluntary deductible is actually, for many people, a no-brainer. They should just go for it. Why? Because the premium discount is actually relatively high. Given how everything works, it's a favorable choice for many individuals to actually go for that. However, it turns out that almost nobody does so. And that's essentially their paper. So it's a puzzle. Why is that, right? Why do people make bad choices? Also in our data, max 5% of the people actually choose that voluntary deductible. And that brings us to that question that we had earlier, how about self-selection and so on? It simply doesn't happen all that much, at least in our data. That has changed a little bit over the last years. But for us, we believe it's fine to actually just drop these individuals who do select a voluntary deductible and carry out the analysis for the bulk of people who don't. Having said that, so we work with these year pairs, and essentially what that does, and that is something I will come back to later, is it controls for fixed effects. So if selection is basically on the levels of healthcare consumption, that will be fine. That's a small point I can discuss some more later. Good. For the institutions, what might be of interest as well is that essentially you have this basic package. For this basic package, you have the mandatory deductible. There's some exceptions, so some things are not subject to a deductible. GP, so you have a gatekeeper system here. So GP care is exempted, maternity care and care for children under the age of 18, and that is a beautiful opportunity to do a placebo test, which is what we do, and we find 0 effects for children under the age of 18 because they are actually not subject to any financial incentives. Finally, what is also nice is that the deductible is actually paid to the insurer. So the way this works is you have healthcare providers bill the insurer directly, and then the insurer determines whether the insurer has to get money from you for an out-of-pocket payment. It would be very different if you would get a bill from the provider and then you would hand in the bill and you would get reimbursed. The problem you would then have is that when people don't hit the deductible limit, they have no incentive to hand in the bill. So we would have a lot of missing data for people who are under the deductible limit. Something that is not happening here because of the institutions. So that's in a nutshell how it works here.
Some questions from the comments on deductibles. So is the deductible at the individual or family level?
Individual level.
Individual level. No co-insurance after the deductible?
Nope.
Let's see. And then more generally, how did these deductibles increase? Who made the decisions? Were there public comment periods, etc.?
Oh yeah, that's interesting to observe. It's essentially for political reasons. The more right-wing VVD party is in favor of deductibles, and they push towards increasing them, and others are against deductibles. It reflects a little bit, who's in charge. So that was by and large what was happening. It's a very sensitive issue because they said, they're the law, right? It's part of the public debate.
Thank you.
Good. How do we do it? We have data from a Dutch health insurer. We have claims at the daily level. We work with these year pairs. And what we do, as I said, is we select persons who cross the deductible limit between February and August. Why not after August? Well, we want to avoid that there's this issue that, when you hit the deductible limit in, say, November, that there's still like some healthcare need that is around in December that is related to you hitting in November. So therefore, we selected people who hit between February and August. And then we do this percentile matching approach that I talked about before. When deductible limits change over time and you condition on hitting the deductible limit, then obviously you're always ending up with a different set of people. So what you have to do is you have to undo that, right? In 2014, you would get the top 38% of the spenders, and in 2008 you would get the top 47% of the spenders. And of course, these are different individuals, right? So what we do is we say, okay, in 2014 we get the lowest number of people, in the sense that we only get the top 38%. So what we do in 2008, instead of taking the top 47% of the spenders, we also only take the top 38%, and we don't use the other ones who have actually hit but do not belong to the top 38% of the spenders. So put differently, in each year we basically take the top 38% of the spenders, and that means that they're comparable across years or year pairs, because essentially there is not much selection going on in the Netherlands, because insurance is not tied to employment, and insurance is also not tied to, say, age, right? So you have this system of managed competition. You have the insurance providers, and no matter where you work, no matter how old you are, you choose an insurance provider and you pay for your insurance, and they have to accept you. That helps us here. Good. Then, with these data in hand, we estimate the change of expenditure around the turn of the year. And in particular, what we do is we leave out the Christmas period. Obviously, when you want to look at this discontinuity in care consumption, you need to think about this a little bit more. What we did end up doing was to compare the last regular Thursday of year Y to the first regular Thursday in year Y+1. So think of comparing something mid-December to something in the beginning of January 7 or something like that, right? So the first regular Thursday of the new year. We do not use care consumption on weekends, because this is mostly emergency care. We also see like a clear pattern in the data. And then, in order to not have too much noise in the data, we pseudo censor expenditures at 500 euros. So that means we code everything above 500 as 500, but we use different limits. We also do logs. It doesn't really matter for the results, but we thought this was a little bit cleaner, also because when somebody has healthcare expenditures of 15,000 euros, deduct. Yeah. Anyway, with all that, we estimate these discontinuities, and then we test whether the size of the discontinuity for different year pairs depends significantly on the dynamic incentives that are around at the beginning of the second year of the year pair, respectively. As an example.
Great. Some questions
Yep.
before we move on. about the empirical context. Does the content of the basic package vary by year?
Yes, to some extent, and we do actually have a way of taking this into account, which I haven't talked about, but maybe I get to that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but we have thought about this hard. Yeah.
Oh, good. In each year, you take the top X% of spenders and argue that's going to be comparable across years. If people are responding to dynamic incentives, should we worry that there actually is different selection across years? Like it's true under the null hypothesis of no foresight.
Yes, what we need for this to work is that essentially the ordering is preserved, right? And our results that we will find do support that idea, but ultimately it remains an assumption that this is the case. Yeah, so it's based on a set of assumptions that Goldberg and others have spelled out in their paper, and we essentially follow that approach. Yeah.
And insurance plans start in January or some other month?
Yes, you have to decide until the first week of January or something like that, and then it's on a yearly basis, so you can freely choose. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Cool. So this is how it looks like. You have this period in between that we don't use. You have care consumption end of the year, care consumption beginning of the year. These blue dots are actual data points for the year per 2010, 2011. Local linear regressions, the optimal bandwidth turns out to be very big. So it's basically linear regressions that we do. This is what we get. This is one of the key graphs that we sort of get out of this, right? Here we have the change in dynamic incentives. So that would be the PE, the future price, respectively at the start of the second year. And here we have the estimated discontinuity in care consumption around the change of the year. Notice that this is always negative, so care consumption always drops, as it should, because both prices turn from something that is zero, turn from zero to something positive. So care consumption should go down. At the same time, what we should expect is that the stronger dynamic incentives, so the higher the future price, the higher the expected end of year price, the bigger this drop. And this is exactly what we find. So this is this negative slope. And now comes the benefit of having a structural model in the background. That structural model that is floating around in the background allows us to interpret the slope of this line here actually it tells us that the slope of this line is equal to gamma, and it gives a particular meaning even to that gamma prompt. And this is something we derive in detail in the paper. So I don't have time to show that here, so that slope of the line has a very important meaning, and that's important. Good. Here's the slope of the line, -10. So let me explain a little bit what that means. So at face value, -10 means when I change dynamic incentives or the expected end of year price all the way from 0 to 1, then care consumption will decrease by 10.69 euros per day. Okay, that is not yet a number that is very interpretable, because as a policymaker, by changing the deductible limit, you're not going to achieve that. So therefore, what we have done is the following. We said, okay, let's say we change the deductible by 100 euros. So we increase it from 375 euros to 475 euros. What that will mean is that the future price will change by 3.4 percentage points. Okay. At the same time, we do know that daily expenditures at the beginning of the year are on average 12.2 euros. Okay, so what that means is that when I increase the deductible by 100 euros, then at the beginning of the year, care consumption will drop by 3%. This is how we make sense of this number here. This is how you can translate it into something that is directly linked to a policy variable. Good. I have around 10 minutes, is that right?
That's right.
Cool. That should be just fine. The next thing we do is we look into differences across groups in the population. So we found it interesting because there's often the hypothesis around that some groups are better at making decisions than other groups. So think of high and low income individuals. Okay, now, when we look at differences across groups, then in general, two things will be different. One, they will have different medical needs. For instance, here we have young and old people. Old people have, more medical needs than young people. So that probably gives rise to more opportunities to exert moral hazard, and therefore the reaction is bigger. Now, at the same time, it could be that older people are more experienced, are smarter, are wiser, above median income people are better at making decisions, and so on and so forth. So to say something about whether it's one or the other, what we have done is we've actually made use of information that we do have in our data, which is the risk score. So the risk score tells us basically something about expected healthcare consumption. So we have the quintiles of the risk score, and what we could do is we could form these groups, and then we could come up with weights so that the reweighted data always has the same distribution of needs as measured by those risk scores. We've all made them equal to the needs in the baseline sample. Okay, so what you should now think of here when you look at these numbers is that we have made the needs equal. So the needs are not different across those groups. So what that means is, in turn, that differences across groups, they are due to differences in decision making and differences in preferences, and not differences in needs. So here you find the 10 that we had before. Here you find numbers for the other groups. They do vary across groups, but not as much as we would have thought, with the exception of those who are below 45 years of age. It becomes actually even more apparent when you look at percentage changes. Then they're all between 2.5 and 3.5%. And for the overall population, we had like 3%. Arguably, what that shows is that we find evidence for forward-looking behavior across the board, and it does not differ as much across groups as one might have thought, with the exception of people who are below 45 years of age. Good. If there are no questions about that, then I can briefly talk about robustness.
Yeah.
We do a bunch of stuff to make sure that what we find is actually really there. So here's the placebo test that I talked about before. So people under the age of 18 are not subject to cost sharing. Okay, so therefore, when we do the analysis for them, and we simply use the prices that we have used for the adults, then what we should find is no effect. Okay, so I had this figure with the downward sloping relationship, and it should be flat. And this is exactly what we find. So that is already comforting, we thought. The next thing one might be worried about is these changes in prices and insurance coverage over time. And our way to approach that is the following. When you think of calculating a price index for healthcare consumption and and the deductible limits change over time, then you know, you always have a problem, because you're always measuring true, say, healthcare inflation plus the effect of changing limits over time. So what we've done is we've made use of our high frequency data and our setup, and we have taken our samples of individuals, and we've calculated the price index based on care consumption at the end of the year. At the end of the year, there are no financial incentives left, so we have therefore, you know, a cleaner, arguably, setup to calculate that price index, and that price index will help us to make those year pairs comparable to one another, because when we find that when care consumption is free and people consume much more in one year in terms of euros than in another year, that must mean that it's either prices that have increased or coverage that has increased. And then we can use that as a deflator, basically, and make these year pairs comparable to one another. That's in a nutshell what we do there. Then we ask the question whether indeed current prices at the beginning of the year are empirically, you know, not related to the expected end of year price, as we have basically assumed. I told you in the very beginning that at the beginning of the year they're 1. Empirically, they can be, you know, 0 when somebody has a lot of care consumption early in the year. We check whether that's the case, and we don't find evidence for something that should worry us. Strategic timing of medical care use. Here, the incentive basically goes the other way around than in many other settings. So given what we do, given that we select people who have already hit the deductible limit, they should front load care. So they should consume early, and they should do that in all years. And the incentive to do that is the same in all years. So therefore, we're not so worried about that. So we explain this in more detail. And finally, lots of specification tests, logs, different censoring thresholds, and so on and so forth. Different sizes of these periods we leave out. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the effect of increasing the deductible by 100 euros on annual expenditures. So far, I've talked about expenditures at the beginning of the year, the effect on expenditures at the beginning of the year. But there's much more, and the framework that is in the background is able to do much more. So what we do here is we talk about 3 separate effects. So when I increase the deductible by 100 euros, this will have an effect on static incentives, simply because they will be in place for a longer time, right? So people will hit the deductible limit later, and you know, for that reason, they're subject to static incentives for a longer time. And then, of course, they have an effect on dynamic incentives as well. So this static incentive effect is a prevalence effect. We have a similar prevalence effect for dynamic incentives. They're simply there for longer. And then we have an intensity effect. So dynamic incentives change in terms of the magnitude. So when I increase the deductible limit, the expected end of year price increases. So that also has an effect. We know this parameter gamma E that we can use for this. This is the reaction to dynamic incentives. We know the model structure that will help us to do the simulations. What we still have to do is to take basically the dependence of the incentives on the deductible limit from the data. Okay, and that is something that is not so common, but that we believe works quite well here, and that's akin to something that people do in empirical I/O when they use a particular approach to estimate dynamic structural models. They take certain things just from the data, even though it is the result of choices. And obviously, incentives at a later point in time are the effect of choices. We simply take that from the data. And I'm sorry, I don't have more time to talk about that. You know, it's not new, but it is relatively new to that literature, I would argue. We've split it up by below median and above median risk score. And what we have here is from the data directly, what is happening for a 375 deductible. This is the dashed line here. So what do I see here? I see the average current price, the average static incentive over time, okay, throughout the year. So the blue ones are the below median risk scores, the yellow ones are the above median risk scores. And what you do see is, of course, in the beginning, everybody faces static incentives, and you know, in the end, only 40%. Okay, so that means 60% will have hit the deductible limit by the end of the year. So we can take this line here, the dashed line, respectively. We can take directly from the data. How do we get the solid line? The solid line we get by pooling the data across all years, and then for every day of the year, running a regression of that quantity here on the deductible amount. Then we get a coefficient on the deductible amount, and then we can extrapolate and predict what the incentive would look like in this counterfactual year that is not in our data with a 475 deductible. So we do an extrapolation exercise. So we basically say going from 375 to 475 is more or less the opposite of going from 375 to 275, which is something that is in principle in our data. Notice how it looks, right? This is this monotone relationship. Dynamic incentives look a little bit different. However, what we have here is the dynamic incentive conditional on not having hit the deductible. Okay, so that will be, for instance, in July, for the above median risk scores will be something like 0.6. So that is the expected price they will pay for the last unit of care consumed in that year. And the later they are in that, the later we look at this in the year, the higher this number, because of course, when you haven't hit by December 15, you're very unlikely to hit by December 31, and therefore very likely you will pay for the last unit of care in that year. This is very much in a nutshell how we estimate the incentives people will face. And then I make a big jump without providing you with all the details, but I'm quickly going to discuss the results. What we get when we combine this with the parameter, the key parameter we have estimated, that gamma E, is we basically get the reaction to dynamic incentives. We get the prevalence effect and we get an intensity effect. So what does that mean? The prevalence effect is, what does it do that there are dynamic incentives around? It decreases care consumption in that year by 86.46 euros. You can say, is that a lot? Is that not so much? Average care consumption in our sample is 2,000 euros. Like in the US, it will be a very different number. Here, it's 2,000 euros. Okay, so this is sort of the benchmark. The intensity effect is 33 euros. By increasing the deductible limit by 100 euros, I make these dynamic incentives stronger, and the effect of that is a 33 euro reduction in care consumption. And here we have put the reaction to static incentives as a comparison. We don't estimate the parameter we need to calculate that. This is done in another paper that we have written, and we also, we find an estimate of 40%, which is incredibly close to the estimate Brod Goldberg and others find. So therefore, we say, 40% is our favorite estimate. If we have 40% and if we have these incentives as estimated before, then the effect of static incentives will be 91.65 euros. Okay, that is interesting because essentially this is 4.6% of care consumption. This is 6% of care consumption, and together we get 10.6% of care consumption as an effect of increasing the deductible by 100 euros. What do we find interesting here? Well, what we find interesting here is that the effect of dynamic incentives is so big. Okay, so in other contexts, the finding was that it's mainly static incentives that drive behavior. But then, of course, many things are different. And here, what is a big difference is that deductibles are actually relatively low. That means dynamic incentives are relatively important, and that might explain actually why we find these big effects. But what we do think is that they are actually important, as something to think about and to quantify when thinking about, individual behavior and care consumption. Yeah, with this, I'd like to wrap up. So what we do is we develop a new microfounded approach to quantify the reaction to dynamic incentives. We do find evidence in favor of individuals being forward-looking. We find similar reactions across groups, or at least we find across the board that groups are forward-looking. €100 increase in deductible size reduces daily expenditures at the beginning of the year by around 3%. That's solely the effect of dynamic incentives. At the yearly level, we get a reduction that's even bigger, 6%, plus or in comparison to the 4.6%, which would be the effect of static incentives, which is a pure prevalence effect. Yeah, that's what I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. If folks have questions, feel free to post them in the question and answer. I have a few that I've been collating, kind of like big picture and then some more specific ones, but I think the big picture ones are most important. So we have questions around provider responses versus consumer responses. How do we interpret what's going on? To what extent are providers aware of this and being strategic? And what is this, a partial versus general equilibrium effect? Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's a great topic. We're actually working on that in a follow-up project on providers, actually, how they behave in such a world. To give a bit of a background to all this, so the way this works here is that you have insurance companies. They have the basic package that they offer. Then the basic package has certain ingredients, and you have the providers, and essentially the set of providers is pretty similar for different insurance companies. Then insurance companies would negotiate prices with those providers. And at the same time, you have a system where the GP is the gatekeeper. So the GP has to refer you to a specialist, right? I can't say yet what exactly is going on there and to what extent it's general equilibrium effects. Here, we take a partial equilibrium, study the individual perspective view, I would say. So we have a model for individual behavior, and then we take that to the data, absolutely. So in that sense, we don't say much about that.
Okay. Another question in terms of
without really being an answer. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I was thinking about congestion. I was thinking also a little bit about learning, right? You're identifying off of changes. So you're still identifying that people respond to these dynamic incentives. It's possible that maybe over time they would learn and respond even more to them. I can't think of a story where they would learn over time and then respond less. So.
Yeah, that's right. We haven't studied that. We could do that. So that's a nice thing probably to do. We could, let's see. Simply by looking at this picture here, here are the changes to dynamic incentives. So I was thinking, why not split it up into like, this is what was happening early on, right? And this is what was happening later on. It looks as if this is just a continuation of that, but that would suggest that there's not much learning going on, and the relationship is more or less stable over time. But that's just the first thought. So we can think about that some more.
Great. Do other folks have questions? Oh, I wanted to touch back on front loading while we're still here. So there is incentives in every year to front load, right? So that you have consume it when there's zero price, not next year. But the incentives do seem stronger in years where you face a higher expected out-of-pocket price, right? So like every year it's better to do it when it's free than when it's costly. But when the deductible goes up, the delay is slightly more costly. Is that right, or does that not work?
Yeah, it depends. So we thought about this for quite a while, and it depends really on how you think about sort of the cost, right? So when you think about, how much does it cost you when you front load, then the price will be zero, right? In some sense, that should mean, we thought, that people should simply go for that, right? Irrespective of what the price is in the next year. But of course, when you say, okay, it should also depend on, say, the alternative, then an argument like that could be made. That's absolutely true. To what extent is that something we expect to have an effect? Well, when you look at this figure here, right? So dynamic incentives, they do vary, but from year to year, they vary very little, right? In that sense, I'm not sure to what extent that should explain our results, right? If we were to, yeah, so I'm not sure. So theoretically, I can see the point. Whether it makes practically a difference, I'm not so sure.
Okay, great. All right, I don't see any other questions. So is there anything else you wanted to respond to, things that came out in the chat, co-authors? All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate.
Keith, maybe I would like to say something to this very last point about the front loading. And I think one thing in the Netherlands, I think it's actually very hard to do, because for most care, you would need a referral from a GP to get any specific treatment. And this GP can actually book at a place in the Dutch institutional setting. So he would immediately book you at a GP and would say you the next available appointment is in 2 weeks at this specialist in the neighboring city. And it's just hard to think about how you would front load in such a setting, because I don't know what way there would be to get an even earlier treatment. So, but it's always possible to postpone treatment, and that also makes very much sense what you say. There's a cost associated with postponing treatment. It's very hard to think this, whether this kind of front loading in this Dutch context, it's really feasible. And then it's also not so clear what the cost associated with this would be. So this is just one thought about it. So I'm sorry for interrupting. So.
No, that's great. So maybe one thing to add. So in recent years, people have started to actually choose these voluntary deductibles more frequently. And then it becomes more of an interesting issue, right? So because then what you can have is this phenomenon that you consume a lot of care still in this year, because for the next year, you're going to choose that high deductible, right? And then those two decisions will become intertwined, right? So you have basically endogenous dynamic incentives in the second year of the year pair. And that is a whole different ballgame, I would say. For us, that is not yet at play, but that could be an interesting thing to look at as well. But that's not what we do here.
Nice. Also thinking about the connection to the literature, as you noted at the beginning, there's a variety of papers that come down with different estimates about whether people are, how forward-looking people are, if at all. And one, sources of identification between these papers vary, and so you're using a change that everyone is experiencing, whereas perhaps in other papers they might be using changes that just this employer group might be experiencing. So I guess it's connected a little bit to questions about how do we interpret provider responses. This is a society-wide change as opposed to an individual specific change. We might wonder about.
Yeah, so one thing we see as a selling point of our paper is that we use a feature that's fairly standard, right? Deductibles do reset, at the start of the new year, and in many contexts, there's at least hope that the deductible amount will change over time. So by looking at various year pairs, one can do what we do, right? What we would love to see is that somebody does this also for another country and sees what comes out, right? So whether it will confirm these findings for the US or not, right? So that would be fantastic if we could see that.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tobias. And
Pleasure.
Panelists and folks who asked questions. This was lovely. I've been instructed to plug number 12 in the series of the Electronic Health Economics Colloquium. So on September 23rd at the same time, whatever time zone you're in, there'll be paper Maternal Mortality and Women's Political Participation by Athindar Venkataramani, and we are looking forward to that as well.